Hello and welcome to our topic today, trauma-informed organizations. If you haven't joined us before, my name is Kira McGillivray, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and the Chief Program Officer of School-Based Initiatives at Children and Families First, which is a statewide nonprofit in Delaware. I'm also the co-director of the Brain Science Training Institute, which I co-direct with Shannon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Fish. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm the Director of Operations and Risk Management at Children and Families First, as well as the co-director of the Brain Science Training Institute.
Brain Science Training Institute is a service of Children and Families First, where we provide training to the public and organizations on trauma, brain science, and the impact on our communities. And we also support individuals and organizations on how they can actually help individuals who've experienced stress. If you'd like to learn more about our Brain Science Training Institute, you can scan the QR code there. We have two objectives for our topic, which is to define and recognize trauma-informed care principles in the workplace, and then understand how to address performance concerns using trauma-informed principles. So let's talk about what is trauma. There are a lot of definitions out there, but we really like this one that states that trauma is a threat or series of threats that overwhelms our nervous system and it impacts our mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well-being. So many different areas of our functioning. Trauma usually involves an intense fear, a threat to our safety, and usually involves a sense of helplessness. And it can also overwhelm a person's ability to cope. So there are different types of traumatic experiences we may have. So we have acute traumas, which are one-time incidents. So this may look like a house fire or a car accident, for example. And then we have chronic trauma, which is the experience of ongoing and cumulative stress. So this may look like ongoing child abuse or domestic violence or parental substance use. And then we have complex trauma, which is the experience of multiple and varied traumatic events. And so this is where someone has experienced many different types of events throughout their lifetime. This could look like community violence and child abuse, food insecurity. And then we have historical trauma, which is where we see discrimination and depression, community violence, deportation, for example. And then we have vicarious trauma, which is the act of observing or witnessing the trauma of others. So the individual hasn't directly experienced the trauma themselves, but they have bared witness to it in some capacity. Vicarious trauma usually impacts our counselors and therapists, our social workers, first responders, and those in our medical fields like nurses and doctors, for example, where they haven't necessarily experienced the traumatic event themselves, but again, they have heard the story or they are attending to it in some capacity. Ultimately, what trauma does is it stresses our body. And with our focus on today's topic is to really look at that vicarious trauma and recognizing that staff may have also experienced their own acute or chronic or historical stressors, in addition to how their clinical work is impacting them as well in the workplace. So individuals are showing up to work with potential stressors, and work itself can be a stressor because they have this vicarious trauma that they are susceptible to. About how toxic stress impacts the brain. And so in order to do that, we're going to kind of need to have a foundation of how the brain works. And so I'm going to be using my hand to demonstrate how our brain is kind of developed and how it works. So we have what we call a downstairs brain and an upstairs brain. Our downstairs brain is represented by the palm of my hand here, and it's our oldest, most primitive part of our brain. And it houses our brainstem, which is in charge of our most basic functions like breathing, heart rate, reproduction, digestion, blinking, basically anything happening at an unconscious level. We also have our limbic region, which houses our very strong emotions like fear and anger and love. And then we have our amygdala, which is represented by my thumb here, which is our alarm system. It alerts us to potentially life-threatening situations around us. And then we have our upstairs brain, which is our rational, logical, decision-making brain. It gives us the ability to have self-reflection and empathy and trust and weighing pros and cons. Specifically, in our upstairs brain is something called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is located right here on my fingers or right here if you were looking at yourself in a mirror. And it has many roles, but one of those roles is to actually regulate the downstairs brain. So we'll give an example of how this may look like in real life. So we're going to assume that you have been in a car or been driving before and had that almost experience of being in a car accident. Someone swerved into your lane or they ran a red light. There was an almost accident. And you might have noticed that your heart started beating pretty quickly. You might have tightened up on the steering wheel. You might have cursed, and that's all okay. Those are all downstairs brain reactions. So what happened was your amygdala sounded the alarm, and when it did that, it hijacked the upstairs brain, and your downstairs brain started sending signals to the rest of your body to react to the potentially life-threatening event in front of you. Now, there was no actual accident. So what happens is your medial prefrontal cortex, that watchtower, says, whoa, whoa, everything's okay. There was no accident, and it comes back online. Why this is important is because when individuals are experiencing chronic stress, stress in the workplace, or crises, what happens is their amygdala sounds the alarm, and they tend to come from a downstairs brain reactionary space instead of the upstairs rational, logical decision-making space. And as organizations, as leaders, as supervisors, we want to help folks stay in a regulated state, which means their upstairs brain area. And so what we're talking about today are ways to help individuals stay in an upstairs brain state. And then for those individuals who are maybe coming from their downstairs brain, how we can help support them into a more regulated space. So what you see here are all upstairs brain tasks. So we have to be in that upstairs brain to do these things. And it's why workplace well-being, attending to organizational stress, and looking at workload is so important because impulse control, flexible thinking, working memory, comprehension are all items that happen when we are in a regulated space and our downstairs brain is in a relaxed state. And so we want to think about ways as an organization that we can create systems and practices and policies that allow people to stay in this state. Because after all, we need folks in the workplace to be able to do these things. And so Shannon's going to talk a little bit more about those kind of practices that we can look at.
So as we think about organizational management from a trauma-informed perspective, we want to put it in perspective first, where there's really this three-pronged approach to well-being and trauma-informed care in the workplace. There is a part that the individual staff or the employee has where they are responsible to take care of their own well-being, to take the initiative, to manage themselves and their workloads and their work-life balance in a way that they can be effective and supportive. There's also a responsibility within the supervisory relationship that the supervisor provides those supports and those strengths to the individual so that they can succeed and address whatever workplace burnout or chronic stress that they're experiencing. But today we'll be talking about a framework for organizational management that comes from that trauma-informed perspective. So this is how the organization structures itself, looks at its policies, its procedures, its culture in a way that promotes trauma-informed care values and well-being of staff. So looking at this organizational approach, it starts with SAMHSA's trauma-informed framework. So being trauma-informed is not a one and done activity. It's not something that we can, as an organization, check off the box and say, oh, I've done these 5 things. I'm now trauma-informed. I don't have to do anything again. Really, trauma-informed care is a journey that organizations will take, and you can be anywhere on this pathway at any given time. You can also be in different parts of this pathway whether you're looking at how you support staff or how you create culture or how you manage your physical facilities. So, the first step in becoming trauma informed as an organization is awareness. This is where organizations understand the prevalence and the impact on trauma and toxic stress on its clients and on its staff. And it is aware, it has some understanding of this information, but the organization has not yet taken any active steps to incorporate that information into how it structures itself. Then we become sensitive when the organization begins to explore those steps. They take the understanding, they take these principles, and they prepare the organization to make changes to its policies, to its facilities, to how it provides supervision and performance management. From sensitive, they move into responsive when they're beginning to make change at all levels of their organization. So they're looking at both how their direct care staff, their providers, and their caretakers are providing services to their clients or to their patients. They're also looking at how their administrative departments function and support the staff and the organizational well-being. They're looking at how their leaders operate and manage organizational culture from a trauma-informed perspective. Then finally, organizations become trauma-informed when these practices are so embedded that they're happening routinely and consistently, that organizations, every time they have to create a new policy, create it from a trauma-informed perspective. When they hire staff, it's part of the conversation about being trauma-informed. And so they keep this on the agenda, on their cultural radar throughout all levels of their organization. Now, to become just in the aware stage, SAMHSA also says that organizations needs to understand that there are 4 assumptions of trauma-informed care. And really understanding this basic information is that first step to becoming trauma-informed. So organizations first realize the prevalence of adversity or toxic stress and trauma and its impact again on their staff and on their clients. So realization is that first step. But then they're able to recognize what those signs and symptoms look like in their clients and staff by taking this information and understanding how the staff are showing up, how the clients are showing up in the workplace, and whether or not they're experiencing these signs or symptoms of chronic stress or trauma. Then the organization responds to this information by changing its policies, its procedures, its physical environment, its culture in a way that addresses the signs and symptoms and the prevalence that they've already realized and recognized. And then finally, by doing this, the organization is actively able to resist the re-traumatization of everyone involved in the system. So that individuals, by becoming involved or employed within the organization, don't continue to experience further stress or burnout or any other types of trauma. Embedded within those 4 R's, as they're called, and embedded within the trauma-informed framework are core principles. So these core principles are really the kind of cultural foundation of how an organization is going to think about their policies and their procedures, their staff supervision, their workplace activities that they do. So again, this starts with acknowledgement, which is just like realizing and recognizing. We need to acknowledge that our staff, our providers show up with their own experiences of toxic stress or trauma, as well as the fact that the workplace can include burnout and compassion fatigue and chronic stress, and our clients show up in that same way. So we acknowledge those signs and symptoms, and we acknowledge the stress that our workplace is under. Then we want to find opportunities where we can provide collaboration, which goes very well with choice and control toward the bottom of the list. where the organization is actively seeking and finding opportunities to elicit feedback from their staff and from their clients about what is working, what is not working. When change has to happen, the organization utilizes individuals who will be affected by that change to figure out how to implement whatever the change might be so that their voice is again heard in that context. You also have compassion and strengths based, where we're understanding where the person is when they're showing up. We're understanding and identifying their strengths and being able to help them leverage and empower them to use their strengths within the workplace or within the services that they are receiving. And then finally, we have trust and safety, which get at being able to provide a culture of well being where staff and clients feel emotionally safe to be able to address concerns. And they also feel that they have a trusting relationship where if they raise concerns or raise issues, there won't be any fear of retaliation, that they can continue to be a voice within the organization to further change and to empower trauma informed care. So by utilizing these principles, an organization can begin to leverage and think about what steps they might take to become trauma informed.
So you may be asking yourself, how do I practice this trauma-informed care approach that Shannon just went over and balance performance management and addressing concerns within the workplace? Because it does require a balance. How do you practice empathy and compassion as well as address concerns? And so, first, we want to make sure that we're having routine supervision, because if we're not having routine supervision, then that doesn't give us the time and space to be able to address concerns when they come up. And we also want to make sure that we're having that routine supervision so that we can create a strong supervisory relationship. So when we're looking at addressing concerns using a trauma-informed approach, we want to kind of ask ourselves, what do we think may be going on? We're kind of coming from a space where we're curious and we're seeking to understand what is happening with the individual. And we want to kind of have this conversation with ourselves before we even approach the individual to address the concern. And then we want to think about what trauma-informed principles that Shannon just went over are going to be helpful when we have the conversation. What do we think the staff member might need a little bit more of? Is it more compassion? Do we need to talk about safety? And some of this will come from the conversation that you end up having with the individual. And then we want to also ask ourselves, is this an individual concern or a group concern or both? Sometimes what an individual may have a strong voice or feel confident bringing up things, but it's an actual group concern that the whole team is dealing with. And so we may need to approach things from an individual level, a group level, or sometimes both. And then we want to establish what a collaborative plan is going to look like with the individual. We want to understand their concerns, what we think their strengths are, and how we can work together to address whatever is happening. And collaboration is so important because we want to provide that choice that Shannon was talking about. When individuals feel like they have some choice and control in their plan of action, they tend to come from a more regulated upstairs brain state that we talked about earlier. And then lastly, we want to think about, how do we recharge and take care of ourselves? Being in a supervisory or leadership role can also take a toll on yourself. No one ever loves addressing concerns. And so we want to make sure that we find ways that we can check in with ourselves. Perhaps we do this through a colleague that we can kind of soundboard ideas off of, or maybe we have our own coping skills that we use, but we always want to make sure that we touch on that at the end. You see are two diverging paths on addressing concerns when we're talking about performance management or a disciplinary approach. And really, what we're talking about here is, in one path, it leads to termination. And then in another path, it leads to retention. So let's talk about the termination path first. So what you'll see in the purple is that there is a performance concern. And the way that we view it may ultimately lead to us thinking that this was some sort of willful defiance, that they did something because they didn't want to do it. And how we usually respond when we have that feeling is through punishment. So there's some sort of reprimand. Maybe they're getting a written warning, or maybe we're threatening that something may occur if they don't, increase their productivity, for example. And so what ends up happening is that individual starts to have a little bit of that decreased belonging. They might start to withdraw from the organizational culture. They might be a bit more disengaged from the team, more stressed, more frustrated. And what that ends up leading to is a more poor work performance. So it actually does the opposite of what we're hoping to do. And that usually stress kind of decreases our ability to do things properly. We end up coming from our downstairs brain, which then puts everything of those executive functioning skills offline that we discussed earlier. And then what ends up happening is termination, because the work that we wanted to see improve didn't end up getting done or improving. The other way, which often leads to retention, is when there is a performance concern, we start to look at it as this internal dysregulation. So we start to seek out what's going on, get curious, and see, why is this person having an inability to kind of do their job duties or their responsibilities? And so we're approaching it just a little bit differently than that defiance piece. And then instead of just moving to punishment, we have this collaborative planning. So we're building on that collaboration, the choice and control, and we're establishing a plan where both voices are being heard. And so the staff is able to kind of identify some skill sets they might need to be able to fulfill the responsibilities. And the supervisor as well is having a say in what might need to be done to get improvement. And then what that ends up doing is it builds relationships. There's trust, there's safety, there's collaboration. And so now there's a stronger relationship between the supervisor and the staff member. And what ends up happening is this often leads to improved work performance because the staff feels supported, they feel like they belong, they feel valued, and they feel like they have strengths that will lead to ultimately an organization that is successful. And so what ends up happening is we end up retaining the staff member instead of the other path where it may lead to termination. And so when we are thinking about trauma-informed care and addressing performance concerns, we acknowledge that the accountability piece has to be there. We, at the end of the day, are organizations where there are clients, there is work that has to be done. And so we want to make sure individuals feel like they have the skills to hold individuals accountable while practicing trauma-informed care. And so there are 3 steps into practicing trauma-informed accountability. The first is to acknowledge the individual's strengths. We always feel good when we hear our strengths and the things that we're doing well. And this helps to create alignment before moving into that performance concern. So setting a positive intention, talking about the ways that the staff member helps the organizational culture and how they help their clients is a great way to kind of de-escalate any feelings coming into the conversation. And then we want to gain perspective. So this is the getting curious part and validating what the individual is bringing to you. So here you're providing empathy, you're listening to them, validating the staff's feelings, and showing genuine concern for why perhaps they're having this performance concern. And you want to explore their perspective. We may already have an idea of what's going on, but we don't want that to rule the conversation. We want to understand where the other individual's perspective is coming from. And then from there, we can start to outline the plan. We can review the expectations of the job and look at some things that we're going to do to improve that performance concern. And we're going to make sure that we set goals and time to review it. So we want some sort of timestamp on this so that we can be clear about the expectation and when we expect it to be completed. And then we want to set some boundaries around this and limits. And then lastly, again, we'll say it again, you want to be able to regulate yourself after the conversation, but also connect with the individual as well. Make sure that we're not just ending on a note where the individual might feel like they have a lot of work to do. We want to once again validate their strengths and that we believe that you can reach this plan together. Other helpful tips are just to allow silence for processing. Many individuals need time to think through things before responding. And so allowing time for that when you have the conversation. And then you always want to address in a timely manner. You don't want to wait a month or until the performance review to address things. You want to do that during your routine supervision that Shannon discussed earlier. And here are our references that you can look up. And if you have more information, you can always reach out to us as well if you have questions. Thank you so much.